Letter from Captain Cook to his agents, March 4th, 1825. You are aware of my leaving this port on the 24th ult. With passengers and goods for Mexico. And I beg to acquaint you with my return here this morning at 1 a.m. under the following circumstances. Captain Cook of the 200-ton brigantine, the Cambria, certainly had not had the voyage he had expected when he had departed Falmouth a week earlier. Not only was he back far too quickly, but he also had approximately 550 more people on board than he had departed with.
Hello, and welcome to the Shipwreck Archive.
Thank you. Would you happen to have the story, The Fiery Rescue of the Kent?
Here we are. Enjoy!
The Cambria's premature return to port started with the departure of an entirely different pair of ships down the English Channel in late February. Both the Scaleby Castle and the Kent belonged to the East India Company and were engaged in carrying the 31st Regiment from Gravesend to Calcutta. The two ships parted off Portsmouth, and the Scaleby Castle arrived in India in June uneventfully. The Kent would never join her. The Kent never got past the Bay of Biscay. The Kent was a newly built East Indiaman of 1,350 tons, sailing under the command of Captain Henry Cobb. On board, she carried the right wing of the 31st Regiment. One count says 344 soldiers, 20 military officers, 43 women associated with the regiment, 66 children associated with the regiment, as well as 20 private passengers. She also had a crew of 148 men, including the ship's officers, bringing her to a total of 621 people on board of her as she departed from Gravesend. Other accounts put the number at 637 people, and others say it was closer to 650. As is often the case, it is hard to determine an exact number. It was a crowded ship, but not any more crowded than many ships that were employed to transport troops at the time. On board were also all of the supplies and munitions for the regiment. The Kent proved to be a good sailor, and it seemed as though they were going to make a fast passage with a favorable wind as they lost sight of the coast of England on the 23rd of February. That was until the 28th of February, while in the Bay of Biscay, a sudden and violent gale struck the ship from the southwest and continued through the night. For the sailors and the ship's officers, the storm was nothing that they could not manage, so long as they handled the ship well. The soldiers who were less experienced on ships in a storm had a less pleasant time, and they required lifelines strung across the deck to stand watch. The ship, heavily laden as she was with 100 tons of shot and shells, rolled badly, and anything that was not well secured to the deck of the ship was thrown around by the movement. This was enough to cause alarm for one of the officers of the ship, who, accompanied by 2 sailors, decided to ensure that everything was well stowed below, and not being flung around as well. The 3 carried with them a safety lantern for light, and by its light they found that one of the barrels of spirits that was carried on the ship had broken free. The sailors were immediately sent for wood to secure the cask in place. While the officer was waiting for the sailors to return, the ship once more gave a large lurch, and not only did the officer drop the lantern, but the barrel that contained the spirits also gave way, and the strong liquor found its way to the fallen lantern. At least that is one version of the story. Another version says that the 3 members of the crew had snuck down to the hold intending to enjoy some of the spirits, when they accidentally dropped the light into the barrel when the ship lurched. No matter the truth of either account, within minutes, the hold was engulfed in flames. The attention of everyone on the ship was quickly redirected from enduring the gale to fighting the flames below decks that were spreading quickly. Captain Cobb and his officers quickly took action and gave the orders for pumps to be used, as well as buckets and wet sails to try to smother the flames and control the spread, but the fire grew larger even as the sailors and soldiers followed their commands. Soon, the smoke was coming from all 4 hatchways in the deck, and Captain Cobb gave the only command he could still think of in the situation. He ordered that the lower decks be scuttled, in the hopes that this would put out the growing inferno. Some of the sick soldiers, 1 woman, and several of the children who had all been trapped below deck had already fallen victim to the smoke. Captain Cobb could only hope that he could prevent any further losses. In the minds of everyone was the ship's heavy load of munitions, which would explode if the fire reached them. The officers of the 31st took it upon themselves to risk the danger of going below decks into the smoke to open the ports and let the water in. And they barely managed it due to the lack of air. The water was soon up to their knees, which slowed the fire, but brought with it a new danger. Now the ship was settling in a way that suggested that she was going to sink. Growing alarmed, the men did what they could to shut the ports again before the ship could take on more water. It seemed less and less as though anything they did would save them, and across the ship people began to reunite with their families, huddle together in prayer, or think of the people they had left behind. Major McGregor took a moment to write a few lines, put the paper in a bottle and seal it. It was a simple note, simply giving the names of himself and his family members, what ship they were on, the condition she was in, and reassuring the reader that he and his family were calm, even though they had expected a sad fate. It was later agreed that throughout the ship there was a general calm, and an idea of military discipline remained, even though there was not much anyone could do, and at this point no one was giving orders. Major McGregor never got a chance to throw his bottle into the ocean, though. Out of a sincere hope that they would be able to spot a ship to help them, a sailor had been sent to the foretop to keep watch, and he soon shouted down that a sail was on their lee. It was the first ship that the Kent had seen in the past couple of days, and it came just as everyone was giving up all hope. Major McGregor's bottle was sat on the table and forgotten. The Cambria, under the command of Captain Cook, had seen the distress signal being flown by the Kent as they drew near, and had immediately approached the larger ship to see what they could do to offer aid. As they neared the other ship, though, they discovered that the reason for her distress was fire. So, rather than getting too close to her, they instead took a station to the lee of her, close enough for her boats to reach them. They soon had even more reason to keep their distance. In an attempt to attract help, the Kent had fired guns for a time, though they were not heard over the roar of the storm, and, as the fire spread, the crew were driven away from the guns. Now, as the fire reached each gun, still loaded cannons discharged, adding even more danger to coming close to the Kent. While before the stormy seas had meant that evacuating in the small boats had not seemed like a practical choice on the Kent before the arrival of the Cambria, with another boat within a quarter of an hour of rowing away, the ship's boats were quickly lowered. There were not enough to hold everyone on board, and a couple had already been damaged. But it was ensured that the very first boat to be lowered was filled with the women and some of the children, and they headed to the Cambria. This seems to have been a subject of general agreement. The officers ordered that the boats be guarded by men with drawn swords to ensure that no one rushed them, but no one was reported to have attempted it. The boat was dangerously heavily loaded, though, once it reached the water, to the extent a couple of people shouted that it was going to be swamped, but they managed to reach the Cambria and be pulled on board. The first person to reach the deck of the Cambria was the infant son of Major McGregor, who was handed up out of the boat by the fourth mate of the Kent. The sailors from the Kent who made up the crew of the boat initially said that they would not return to the burning ship. But Captain Cook informed them that he would not allow them on board his ship unless everyone from the Kent had been saved. As so, they were forced to return. Captain Cook had organized his entire crew, including the 36 miners who were traveling as passengers, to help with the rescue and to pull the survivors up onto his ship. But unloading each boat still took time, and then it took another quarter of an hour for each boat to return to the Kent. In total, the people on board the Kent estimated that the painful interval of waiting each boat to return was 3/4 of an hour, while they stood on the deck of a ship that was both burning and sinking. The first boat proved to be the easiest to load. The seas turned against them even more, and the boats could no longer pull alongside the burning ship. Instead, they were forced to go to the stern of the Kent, where more of the women and children were tied together and lowered into the boats that way. In many cases, lowering them into the actual boats was too challenging, and the people who were being lowered found themselves plunged into the water, hoping that they would be pulled out of the water by the waiting boats in time. More people were lost in this way. The toll was especially high on the young children, who were more difficult to keep above the water. The soldiers and sailors were now allowed to see what they could do to reach the boats and preserve themselves. Everyone on board was aware that the fire was going to reach the ship's magazine at some point, and when it did, it was not likely that anyone would escape the explosion. While the officers still felt it was their duty to remain at their posts, no one had the heart to stop the men under them from trying to escape. Some of the people on board the Kent, who were confident in their swimming ability, decided to not wait for the boats, and instead decided to swim for the safety of the other ship. Some of them even tied their children to them. Some of the people who attempted the swim reached safety, but some were overwhelmed by the waves. Fortunately, some of the people who were struggling in the water were pulled up by the boats in time. At the start of the evacuation, the Kent had 6 boats that they were able to put into use. As the day wore on, though, 3 disappeared, in one case with a full load of people. The large number of people loaded onto each boat, as well as rough seas, proved too much. As the situation on the ship grew worse, they were only able to evacuate by crawling along the spanker boom, and then swing by a rope that had been attached to it by a waiting boat. It was not something that everyone was willing to attempt, even with a burning deck beneath their feet. The higher-ranking officers of the 31st, as well as Captain Cobb, had remained on the deck without abandoning the Kent until everyone who was willing to attempt the boats was gone. By then, the sun had set. They estimated that it was around 8 p.m. Captain Cobb and Colonel Farron were the last 2 people to pass along the spanker boom. Captain Cobb managed the trip with relative success, only a little bruised and wet, but Captain Farron was repeatedly struck against the side of the ship as he swung on the rope, as well as plunged into the sea. By the time he was pulled out of the water by the boat, he was barely conscious. Still, Captain Cobb insisted on staying alongside the ship for another quarter of an hour, calling up to the men who remained on deck to try to save themselves. It was only when he got no answer that he finally turned away and pulled alongside the Cambria. Captain Cook, on seeing that the boats were not full, and not recognizing that the people on board were the officers, initially refused to let them on board, thinking that, once again, the crew of the Kent was abandoning people in need of rescue. It was only when the fourth mate, who had been an active participant through the hours of rescue work, aided by the boatswain and the third mate, shouted up that they were the last people to be able to escape, did Captain Cook let them on board. By now, the Kent was roaring with flames to such an extent that he also could not imagine sending the sailors alongside her again. Captain Cook was also beginning to become concerned that even at the distance he was at, they would be damaged when the Kent blew up, and he decided to move even further away. Not only that, but his ship was dangerously overcrowded, and Captain Cook could not even be certain if he could safely reach a port in such a condition. The rescue that had started at 2 p.m. had taken 6 exhausting hours. The Kent was fully engulfed in flames by 10 that night, and at 2 in the morning, the explosion that everyone had dreaded finally came. It was smaller than they had worried it would be, though. The order that had been given to fill the lower decks with water meant that a portion of the magazine had been underwater and had not added to the blast. Captain Cook now found himself responsible for 554 more lives. 301 soldiers of the 31st Regiment, 46 women, 48 children, 19 private passengers, 139 sailors, and Captain Cobb. Since the 200-ton Cambria had left port well loaded with just her 11 crew members and 36 passengers, it was a struggle to find space for everyone. 80 people, including most of the women, were placed in a cabin that had only been intended to hold 10 people, while in some places on the ship there wasn't even room to stand, and people were forced to sit on barrels of provisions that had been intended for the voyage. Through all of this, the sailors and miners from the Cambria did everything they could to help their unexpected guests. Many of the people who had escaped the Kent did so in states of various undress, and had lost everything when the ship had gone down. Captain Cobb had not even allowed his crew to save the valuable ship's instruments, insisting that space that they would take up could be used for people. With this mentality, things such as clothing and other articles had obviously been left behind. The people from the Cambria did what they could with their limited resources to at least clothe the people who were in states of complete undress. The air was so poor below decks on the crowded Cambria that candles extinguished, and they were forced to open the hatches at intervals to let fresh air in while trying not to allow the sea to enter the already overladen ship. After a painful 3-day voyage, Captain Cook was able to return his ship to Falmouth and deposit the people who he had saved there. As the survivor stepped off of his ship, there was one extra. One of the soldiers' wives, 2 hours after having been saved, had given birth to a baby, whom she named Cambria. The town of Falmouth, on being faced with the sudden humanitarian crisis, stepped up quickly, and overnight it was estimated that clothing enough for 600 or 700 people was donated, as was some money. Even Captain Cobb required some kindness. He was forced to borrow a jacket to wear to report to the East India Company what had occurred. Soon a flurry of letters were exchanged between Captain Cook and the survivors, with the survivors expressing their incredible gratitude to Captain Cook for all of his kindness, and Captain Cook reassuring them that he had only done his duty. The East India Company saw to it that Captain Cook was reimbursed for everything that the rescue had cost him, and he, as well as his men, were publicly recognized and given awards for their good deed. Captain Cook made sure to report those he supposed were lost with the sinking of the Kent, though. 64 soldiers, 1 woman, 21 children, and 4 members of the crew, none of whom made it onto his ship. The cost of life was a little less than he believed, however. As the Kent burned, the men who had refused Captain Cobb's entreaties to make the climb along the spanker boom and attempt to escape the ship found themselves driven into the chains of the ship by the flames. When the mast fell overboard, the survivors clung to it and spent some hours floating in the stormy ocean. Fortunately for them, the flames of the burning ship were spotted by Captain Bibby of the Caroline, which was on a voyage from Egypt to Liverpool. On seeing a ship in distress, Captain Bibby directed his ship to the scene to see if assistance was needed. Once he got closer, he sent out a boat which found the men still clinging to the mast. In total, 14 more people were saved by the Caroline. The fire still had a heavy cost of human life, but without the willingness of 2 captains to risk their own ships to save the people in need, it would have been far worse. Through the night, Captain Bibby kept the Caroline near the burning ship in hopes of finding more survivors, but there were none. 2 years later, there was a final epilogue to the story of the Kent. A man who was bathing in the ocean in Barbados found a message in a bottle, and on opening it, found the letter that had been placed in it by Major McGregor. Major McGregor had never thrown it overboard. He had left it on the table when the Cambria had come into sight. It was believed that it must have been thrown into the ocean by the explosion of the magazine. Since it was addressed to Major McGregor's father, the man who found it forwarded it back to the family. A reminder of what they had survived.
For more information, please see A Narrative of the Loss of the Kent East Indiaman by Fire by George Buchan, published in 1825, or see other sources in the description below.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you for visiting the Shipwreck Archives. See you soon.